The call that didn't end. Harlem, late evening. Rain pressed softly against the windows like fingers afraid to knock. Bumpy Johnson sat alone in his office, not surrounded by men, not counting money, not planning territory. For once, the city was quiet around him, that kind of quiet that never meant peace, only anticipation. The desk lamp cast a single circle of light, leaving the corners of the room in shadow, as if the past itself was watching. The phone rang. Bumpy didn't answer immediately. He had learned long ago that some calls changed everything, and once you picked them up, there was no putting the world back the way it was. When he finally lifted the receiver, he heard breathing, not hurried, not panicked, controlled but strained, like someone standing tall under unbearable weight. "Bump," the voice said. His jaw tightened. He knew that voice better than his own reflection. Isaiah Freeman. They grew up on the same cracked streets, ran errands together as boys, shared meals when food was scarce and dreams were cheaper than bread. Isaiah was not just a friend, he was memory, history, proof that Bumpy had once been something other than feared. "Where are you?" Bumpy asked calmly, too calmly. A pause. Then Isaiah spoke again, slower now. "They want you to listen." Bumpy didn't ask who they were. In America, in those years, some truths didn't need names spoken aloud. The line crackled. In the distance, muffled voices, laughter, not joyful, not human, the kind of laughter that came from believing you could decide another man's worth. Bumpy closed his eyes. He had faced bullets, prison walls, betrayals, but nothing prepared him for the helplessness of distance. Power meant nothing when you were miles away and chained by silence. "Isaiah," he said, voice steady but low, "listen to me." "I am listening," Isaiah replied. "That's why I called." The conversation did not last long. It didn't need to. Some moments carved themselves into the soul in seconds. Then the line went dead. Bumpy Johnson sat frozen, the receiver still pressed to his ear long after the sound disappeared. Outside, the rain kept falling, unaware it had just witnessed the breaking of a man who had never bent. That night, Harlem slept, but Bumpy did not. The weight of restraint. The man expected rage. They expected Bumpy Johnson to strike back immediately, to flood streets with retaliation, to prove fear with fear. That was the reputation history liked to tell. But the truth was more dangerous. Bumpy didn't move. He didn't shout orders. He didn't gather soldiers. He didn't touch a weapon. Instead, he walked, alone, through Harlem's streets, past closed shops and dim streetlights, past faces that nodded silently in respect. No one dared stop him. They could feel something heavy trailing behind him, not anger, but resolution. Isaiah's words echoed again and again. "They want you to listen." Bumpy understood now. This was not about killing a man. It was about humiliation, about sending a message that even the strongest black men in America could be reduced to spectators in their own lives. And that was the message Bumpy refused to accept. 6 days of silence. The newspapers never told the full story. They never did. They wrote about incidents, about unfortunate events, about unrest. But Harlem counted days differently. Day 1 passed with rumors. Day 2 brought fear. Day 3 brought prayers whispered behind locked doors. By day 4, mothers pulled their children closer. By day 5, preachers spoke with trembling voices. And by day 6, everyone understood the pattern. Something was hunting, something organized, something that believed terror was a language. 6 days, 6 losses. Not all were close to Bumpy. not all known to the papers, but each one mattered to someone. Each one left a hole in the community that no money could fill. And through all of it, Bumpy Johnson remained silent. To his enemies, it looked like weakness. To Harlem, it felt like the stillness before judgment. A different kind of power. On the seventh night, Bumpy gathered the elders, not the gunmen, not the enforcers, the elders, men who survived longer than rage, women who had buried sons, yet still believed tomorrow deserved dignity. They sat in a circle, no weapons present, only faces carved by years of injustice. Bumpy spoke last. "They want me to become what they already believe I am," he said quietly. "If I answer them their way, they win twice." No one interrupted. "I won't give them that victory." An old woman leaned forward. "Then what will you give them?" Bumpy looked around the room at Harlem itself reflected in tired eyes. "Exposure," he said, "unity, and time. Because some battles are not won with blood, but with patience sharp enough to cut through lies." The promise. Later that night, Bumpy returned to his office. The phone sat where it always had. He lifted the receiver and placed it back down gently. "This ends," he said to the empty room. "Not with revenge, but with truth." Isaiah's voice would never leave him, but neither would the reason Isaiah made that call, not to beg, not to break, but to remind Bumpy of who he truly was, not a gangster, a guardian. And Harlem was watching.
The silence that terrified them more than guns. The city began to notice something unusual long before outsiders did, because Harlem had its own way of sensing danger and change, and this time the danger was not loud, it was quiet, disciplined, and unnerving. Bumpy Johnson did not retreat after the losses, nor did he explode in the way his enemies expected. Instead, he became more visible in places where fear usually hid, walking through neighborhoods during daylight, standing in church doorways on Sundays, sitting with shop owners whose hands still shook when they counted change, and listening more than he spoke. That silence was not empty, it was deliberate, and those who understood power knew it was far more threatening than reckless action, because restraint meant planning, and planning meant that consequences were coming in a form no one could easily predict or stop. Word traveled slowly at first, carried not by newspapers, but by whispers exchanged over counters and stoops, that Bumpy Johnson was building something that did not look like retaliation, but felt heavier than revenge. He met with lawyers who had long avoided his name, not because they believed in him, but because they believed in injustice even less. He met with ministers who had once criticized him openly, now realizing that moral leadership sometimes appeared in unexpected forms. He met with black business owners who had learned to survive by staying invisible, and he told them that invisibility had never saved anyone for long. In these meetings, Bumpy did not promise protection through force. He promised something far more radical for that era: coordination, testimony, records, and unity across fear lines that had been carefully maintained to keep people isolated and weak. The men who had orchestrated the terror did not understand this shift because their entire system relied on provoking emotional reactions that justified further cruelty. They waited for riots that never came, for gunfire that did not echo, for chaos they could point to as proof of their twisted beliefs. But Harlem denied them all of it. Instead, something more unsettling happened. Stories began surfacing, names began circulating quietly, patterns were documented, and connections were traced with a patience that mirrored the discipline of investigators rather than criminals. Bumpy Johnson, the man they had tried to break through humiliation, was turning their cruelty into evidence, and evidence had a way of traveling beyond neighborhoods into courtrooms, churches, and eventually places of power that thrived on plausible deniability.
Inside Bumpy's mind, however, the calm exterior hid a storm that never fully rested, because every step forward was haunted by the memory of Isaiah's voice on the phone, steady even as danger closed in. At night, when Harlem finally slept, Bumpy sat alone with that memory, replaying not the fear in the call, but the intention behind it, understanding that Isaiah had not called to be saved, but to make sure the truth survived. That understanding reshaped Bumpy's definition of strength, forcing him to accept that survival was not always about walking away alive, but about ensuring that injustice could not hide comfortably in darkness, because darkness depended on silence, and silence was exactly what Isaiah had refused to give. As weeks passed, pressure began to shift in subtle but undeniable ways, because systems built on intimidation often collapse under sustained exposure rather than sudden attack. Authorities who had once dismissed complaints now found themselves surrounded by documentation they could no longer ignore without leaving visible fingerprints of neglect. Journalists who had avoided the subject started asking careful questions, not out of courage at first, but out of curiosity, and curiosity had a way of turning into accountability. Even those who despised Bumpy Johnson found themselves forced into an uncomfortable position, because opposing him openly now meant opposing a broader movement rooted in testimony, law, and moral clarity rather than street power, and that made their arguments sound hollow even to those who shared their prejudice. Harlem felt the shift before it could fully explain it, because fear slowly gave way to something unfamiliar yet powerful: confidence without arrogance, unity without uniformity, and courage that did not demand spectacle. Mothers began allowing their children to walk a little farther from home again. Shop owners kept lights on longer into the evening, and churches filled not just with prayer, but with planning. Bumpy Johnson watched this transformation quietly, understanding that leadership was not about being at the center of every action, but about creating conditions where others could stand taller than they had before. And in that realization, he felt closer to Isaiah than he had since the phone call, because Isaiah's final act had not been one of desperation, but one of purpose. By the time those responsible realized they were losing control, it was already too late to reverse the damage, because the battlefield had changed entirely. This was no longer a conflict they could dominate with fear or anonymity. It had become a slow, grinding exposure of a system that relied on being unseen to survive. Bumpy Johnson had not answered hatred with hatred, nor cruelty with chaos. He had answered it with memory, coordination, and resolve, transforming personal loss into communal awakening. And while the city did not yet know how the story would end, one truth had become undeniable by the close of that chapter. The silence they had once used as a weapon had been taken from them, reshaped, and turned into something far more dangerous than noise, the kind of silence that forces the world to listen.
When pressure reached the walls that never expected it. By the time the weight of Harlem's quiet resolve reached beyond its streets, the world that once ignored the neighborhood began to feel an unfamiliar discomfort, because pressure had a way of traveling upward when it was applied patiently and without spectacle. What had started as whispered coordination inside church basements and back rooms of barbershops slowly crossed invisible boundaries, landing on desks where decisions were made by men who had never walked Harlem after dark and never needed to understand its fears. Bumpy Johnson watched this shift from a distance, aware that the moment something becomes visible to power, it is often reshaped, diluted, or denied, and that his greatest challenge was no longer confronting hatred directly, but preventing truth from being softened into something harmless. The cost of this approach began to reveal itself in ways Bumpy had anticipated but never fully prepared for, because restraint demanded sacrifices that aggression never did.
Allies grew cautious, worried that association would threaten their businesses or families, and some quietly withdrew, leaving behind apologies that sounded sincere but felt hollow in the weight of the moment. Even within Harlem, doubt surfaced, not because people stopped believing in justice, but because justice moved slower than grief, and grief demanded immediate answers. Bumpy absorbed these tensions without outward reaction, knowing that leadership often meant standing still while everyone else moved, and that the loneliness of that position was not a punishment, but a responsibility he had accepted the moment he chose not to answer cruelty with chaos. Privately, however, the strain pressed hard against him, especially in moments when the city grew quiet and memory returned uninvited. Isaiah's voice no longer came as a sharp wound, but as a steady presence, reminding Bumpy that the purpose of survival was not comfort, but continuity, that one life lost to injustice did not have to result in a future surrendered to fear. In these moments, Bumpy questioned himself more harshly than any enemy ever could, wondering whether restraint honored Isaiah's courage or merely delayed justice for those still living under threat. And it was this internal conflict, not any external force, that tested his resolve most deeply. As institutions began responding, their reactions exposed the fragile architecture beneath authority, because systems built on selective blindness struggled when confronted with undeniable patterns rather than isolated accusations. Investigations were announced cautiously, framed as routine reviews rather than moral reckonings, but even these limited acknowledgments sent shockwaves through circles that had long relied on silence as protection. Bumpy understood that the goal was not immediate punishment, because symbolic victories faded quickly, but long-term disruption of a culture that thrived on intimidation and invisibility. And so he resisted pressure to declare triumph too early, even as supporters begged for reassurance that the suffering had not been in vain. Harlem itself continued transforming in subtle but powerful ways, as people began seeing themselves not merely as survivors of injustice, but as participants in something larger than fear. Community meetings shifted from mourning to planning, from asking who was lost to asking how future losses could be prevented. And this change in perspective marked a turning point more significant than any headline. Bumpy observed this evolution with quiet pride, recognizing that true leadership was measured not by how loudly one spoke, but by how confidently others began speaking for themselves. And in this realization, he felt Isaiah's influence woven into the fabric of the neighborhood, not as a martyr frozen in tragedy, but as a force that had altered the direction of countless lives. Yet the story was far from resolution, because power rarely yields gracefully, and the forces challenged by this movement began adapting, shifting tactics from overt intimidation to subtle obstruction, delay, and distraction. Files went missing, testimonies were questioned, and narratives were reframed to minimize accountability, reminding Bumpy that injustice did not require cruelty alone to survive. It also relied on patience, bureaucracy, and the exhaustion of those who demanded change. Facing this reality, Bumpy made a choice that surprised even those closest to him, deciding to step further into the light rather than retreat into familiar shadows, understanding that visibility, though dangerous, was now his most effective shield. As his name appeared in places it never had before, associated not with fear but with restraint and coordination, Bumpy Johnson felt the weight of transformation settle fully upon him, because reinvention was never simple and never free. He knew that some would always see him through the lens of his past, dismissing his present actions as strategy rather than sincerity. But he also knew that history was shaped not by unanimous approval, but by persistent truth. Standing at this crossroads, with Harlem watching and the future uncertain, Bumpy accepted that the path he had chosen offered no guarantee of peace or safety, only the possibility that Isaiah's final act would not disappear into silence, and that possibility was enough to keep him moving forward.
The kind of victory that leaves no graves behind. By the time the final stage of the struggle arrived, it did not announce itself with drama or spectacle, because the most consequential endings rarely do. And Bumpy Johnson had come to understand that resolution often looked like exhaustion rather than celebration. The pressure that had built slowly over months now pressed back against him from every direction, not as a single threat, but as a collection of choices that demanded clarity, because every path forward carried consequences not just for him, but for Harlem itself. He felt the weight of expectation in every handshake, every careful conversation, every glance from people who no longer saw him merely as a figure of power, but as a symbol of what restraint could accomplish when rage was the easier option. Institutions that once dismissed Harlem as a problem now spoke about it as a responsibility, and while their language remained cautious and imperfect, the shift itself marked a change that could not be undone. Accountability did not arrive as a dramatic purge or a single decisive ruling. Instead, it unfolded through reforms, exposure, and an unmistakable loss of confidence among those who had relied on fear and invisibility. Bumpy watched this process without triumph, understanding that justice achieved through humiliation often planted the seeds of future violence, and that the goal was not to reverse roles, but to break the cycle entirely. What mattered was not who fell, but what could no longer stand the same way again. Within Harlem, the transformation reached a deeper level because people began measuring strength differently, no longer equating it solely with dominance or retaliation, but with endurance, coordination, and moral clarity. Young men who once believed respect was taken through intimidation now listened to elders speak about patience as strategy rather than weakness, and women who had carried fear quietly for years found their voices amplified by collective resolve. Bumpy observed these changes with a sense of humility that surprised even him, realizing that leadership had shifted away from his singular presence toward a shared confidence that did not require his constant direction. And in that realization, he understood that the truest sign of success was becoming less necessary over time. Isaiah's memory remained ever present, not as a wound reopened, but as a compass that continued guiding decisions long after the immediate crisis had passed. Bumpy no longer replayed the phone call with the same ache. Instead, he reflected on the intention behind it, recognizing that Isaiah's final act was not defined by what was taken from him, but by what he refused to surrender: his voice, his dignity, and his belief that truth mattered even when it offered no protection. That understanding reshaped Bumpy's sense of closure, because closure did not mean forgetting or moving on, but carrying meaning forward in a way that honored sacrifice without glorifying suffering. As time created distance from the events, the story began settling into history, where it risked being simplified, distorted, or reduced to convenient lessons that avoided discomforts. Bumpy resisted this quietly, correcting narratives when necessary, but refusing to polish the truth into something easily digestible, because he knew that progress built on denial eventually collapsed under its own contradictions. He accepted that some would always misunderstand his choices, seeing restraint as calculation rather than conviction,
But he also accepted that legacy was not something one controlled, only something one influenced through consistent action aligned with principle. In his later reflections, Bumpy recognized that the greatest irony of the struggle was how little it resembled the confrontations people expected, because there were no final showdowns, no dramatic reversals that fit neatly into legend. Instead, there was continuity, accountability that unfolded slowly, and a community that learned it did not need to be defined by the worst intentions directed against it. This realization brought a quiet peace that did not erase loss, but placed it within a larger purpose, affirming that dignity could survive even the most deliberate attempts to destroy it. When Bumpy Johnson eventually stepped back from the center of attention, he did so without ceremony, understanding that endings did not require applause to be meaningful. Harlem continued moving forward, shaped by a chapter that proved power did not always announce itself loudly, and that courage sometimes sounded like silence, sustained long enough to force the world to listen. In that continuation, Isaiah's voice endured, not as an echo of fear, but as a reminder that even when cruelty demands spectatorship, choosing truth over rage can transform loss into something that outlives injustice itself.